sais qu'il y en a qui sont prêts à en acheter. It's a cash.
The cash for the thing?
Yeah, but just cash because they have credit cards, bank cards, but they don't have actual cash. And physical, then we need to pay with cash. So that's cash. Cash.
Yes. Oh, there are available. They weren't this morning, but then like 20 people had it. It's like in I'm sorry. I'll get you later. So we have to start. I'm sorry, I got caught up with housekeeping. So the moderator, this is session 10, Archiving-Enactment, Archivage-Replique, avec Thérèse Roy, c'est le modérateur. C'est bien? Merci beaucoup.
Hello, welcome everybody, bienvenue. I see now we have a somewhat intimate room rather than the bigger one, so I hope that that's going to facilitate a wonderful exchange after we hear our 4 presentations. We're going to try to keep them all to 20 minutes each so that we have time left after this. I'm going to ask our speakers to speak slowly so that the translators can keep up with us. And we will be speaking in the order that you see on the program. Ellie Kevorkian, Yulia Prutz, Travis Chamberlain, and then Abby Siebely. Ellie.
Is that test? Test. Anybody?
This is Eleanor Anton, often referred to as Eleonora Antonova, the black ballerina of the Agilent Ballet Group. And that's me in the old blue dress and foxy furs, with my much traveled suitcase over there. And as a ballerina, I probably spend most of my life in trains. But to succeed in this life, one must become stronger and tougher. You must brook no interference in reaching your goal. If, as is often the case, you don't always have a clear picture of just what and where your goals are, never give yourself away. Enemies wait in the wings for the first sign of indecision, especially Russians.
In 2012, I was given an artist commission by Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, for which I conceived of and curated Recollecting Performance, an exhibition of performance art garments and costumes, contextualized by recent audio recordings by these 1970s performance artists. This project was included in the more expansive exhibition, Los Angeles Goes Live, Performance Art in Southern California, 1970 to 83. Funding and promotion came from the Getty Initiative, Pacific Standard Time, which funded over 60 institutions to explore Southern California's own art history. Performance artists emerging from the 60s confronted topics of worldwide concern such as nuclear armament and women's struggle for equality. Responding to an increasingly global capitalist culture, civil rights struggles, and the Vietnam War, they found potential for an artistic revolution, working both individually and collaboratively in a lush atmosphere of art, activism, and play. Innovators of a movement that would forever change thinking about art and the body, these artists brought issues of race, gender, and politics to its borders. Performance artists like Eleanor Anton, Suzanne Lacey, Paul McCarthy, Senga Ngugi, Robert Wilhite with Guy de Quintet, Nancy Buchanan, the Sisters of Survival, the Kipper Kids, Ed Baral, Jackie Apple, Bob and Bob, Kim Jones, Hirokazu Kosaka, Richard Newton, Barbara T. Smith, Johanna Wendt, and John M. White came from all over Southern California, contributing to this dynamic society that was fluid and evolving. There were two exhibition components to Recollecting Performance. On display were original and reconstructed garments and costumes. The second, and equally significant element of the exhibition, provided context for these garments, recent audio recordings by the original artists. This experimental approach to exhibiting performance art invited viewers to imagine themselves within the garments and the performances represented. The figural void contained by the garments invited the memory of the artist and the imagination of the viewer. Framed by memory, this exhibition similarly borrows from the oral tradition of audiences sharing their viewing experiences with others. In contextualizing their own work, many of these artists, some 40 years later, generated secondary performances by their audio recordings, reconstructions, and installations. Current neuroscience tells us that the brain uses different parts to store details and then summon those details to form a memory. It's also acknowledged that to recall a memory is to combine the truth of an event with layers of fiction accruing each time the story is told. In essence, each time the memory is recalled, its neurons transform so that a memory is ever moving and taking new shape. As we share recollections of performance with others, neuronal structures change and we establish social context. Can using memory to contextualize performance be a collective truth? A confluence of social perspectives framed by memory. We can apply this analogy to the general tenets of 70s conceptual art performance. Recollections and performances are both ephemeral and fleeting, maintaining an active evolution long after the event has taken place. Like memories, we see the structure of performance art constantly shift between boundaries of artist, audience, and author. The usual approach when trying to represent performance after it's occurred is to exhibit post-documentation, artifact or detritus from the performance. However, performance art garments and costumes are not merely remnant, but present a sculptural void to be filled by the viewer, an activity that implicates the viewer within the performance. The tradition of audiences sharing and passing on experiences of live performance with others is an important aspect of performance documentation. Stories rely on the passing on of details from the teller to the listener. Yet with each repetition, the retold story adheres less to the fidelity of the original message. While institutions attempt to answer the dilemma of how to present a historical, ephemeral artwork, consider allowing for the possibility of memory's inaccuracies, its own ephemerality. Could this be an alternative to presenting action-based mediums in the most usual and static of ways? Can garments, a sculptural stand-in for the body, and the artist's context make performance art accessible without the performance? For this exhibition, there were no documentary photographs referencing the garments on display, only a label that listed the corresponding dial-up number that accessed the audio recordings. It was my intention that the audio was an equally weighted component of the exhibition. I consider myself to be an artist-centric curator, and that granting autonomy to the artist to contextualize their own work sits in alignment with the radical and autonomous nature of their work. Therefore, the audience received the work's context from the artists themselves. Artists like Eleanor Anton, as we heard earlier, or Ed Barral, shifted between the roles of artist and their performance personas, delivering secondary performances in their recordings. Ed Barral's African-American theater troupe from the 1970s, the Bodacious Buggerilla, performed at a grassroots level for both African-American and Latino communities in South Central Los Angeles. Wearing white face makeup and dressed as Uncle Sam, Barral provided a common oppressor to these two communities experiencing racial tensions heightened by the Watts riots and the Vietnam War.
When Sam steps on the stage after making his way through the catcalls, all the boos and the whistles, he turns, pauses, and says, "I don't know why y'all act like you don't know me. You got up with me this morning, went to bed with me last night. Who you think tucked you in? Y'all's business is my business. I loves and lives in the ghetto. I am the people puppeteer, the magician, the sleight of hand artist. I can make money appear, disappear, show up in somebody else's pocket, just like that." The Boogerilla, with family and kids, were backstage practicing self-defense, holding political education classes, and setting up a suburban farm site for growing their own food. Because, after all, the revolution was just around the corner. And one never knows what might happen in a predatory society that's pretending to be one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Have mercy.
My research included interviewing many performance artists from the era. Each interview lasted a couple of hours, and I was able to record most of them. I forgot to press the record button on my interview with Paul McCarthy. There were many times. There were many times I was taken off record. I had to stop the recorder because the accompanying tale behind a performance was too salacious or wonderfully incriminating that the artist was hesitant to share it publicly. That sort of social aspect seemed to me crucial in setting the tone of the exhibition's installation. The room had to have a cacophonous and social presence, everyone talking, crediting collaborators, discussing their intent in varied ways, some descriptively, some abstractly, some theatrically. From one garment to the next, this was a disparate and incongruous cocktail party for a society of artists making action and body-based work. This seemed to reflect the heterogeneous atmosphere that everyone agreed was present in performance art during the 70s. We used a dial-by-cell service where viewers used their own cell phones to dial up the recording. Many of the artists appreciated the less than perfect audio quality offered by the use of the cell phone. Its fuzzy and warm tone delivered a nostalgic and conceptual quality to the recording. Cell phones today are a part of the everyday vernacular, and that lent a tone of immediacy, much like the performance art economy of the 70s. You used what was available. Although the majority of the artists involved saved a lot of their performance wear, many admitted they never expected it to be shown. But still, these articles were preserved. A few artists were asked to reconstruct an original performance garment. For example, Senga Ngugi reconstructed this headdress using pantyhose from her iconic performance, Ceremony for Freeway Fets, where her ritualistic performance took place under an LA freeway, its dry, barren dirt land evoking the feel of Africa. Here, Barbara T. Smith discusses her original performance of Nude Frieze, while seemingly describing her secondary performance generated by her reconstruction installation.
Hi, this is Barbara T. Smith, and this is the residue of a partial representation of a piece I did at the F-Space Gallery in 1972 called Nude Frieze. This shape holds the sweat and the form of a body, one suspended here on the wall. In their original piece, there were 6 bodies on the wall, held with gaffer's tape and staples. The viewers were kept back by cautionary tape as they witnessed the construction of a frieze, like when you see a new supermarket being built. I was referencing several things. One, that the realm of art is the only safe place in our culture to explore areas of risk without fear of repression and ostracism. So F-Space became a symbolic sanctuary. Further, I felt we were in a new psychic spiritual era, as in early Christian and Byzantine times, and as in those times our work would be anonymous. In the future, no one would know who were the architects or artists or what had happened unless you were there. This is the heart of performance art, a critique of materialism, a celebration of the unrepeatable moment, and a new feeling of connection among people, focusing on the experience of the body.
Although many of these garments were never meant to be viewed beyond the temporal moment of the performance, their exquisite construction and attention to formalist and technical elements clearly denoted, for the most part, a conventional fine art education. While some garments were fastidiously constructed, other artists, like John M. White, had worn everyday streetwear, an important distinction as it was an overt rejection of theatricality. Ordinary garments from the everyday represented no separation from the daily life, an edict he learned from Yvonne Rainian. It wasn't just the spectacularly constructed costume included in this exhibition that was notable, but also the incredibly ordinary garment that, when illuminated by its audio context, became transformed, and we were thus able to consider how performance personas evolved in response to the world around them. It's interesting to also note we labored over the appropriateness of the word costume for those artists who wanted to divorce themselves of the artifice of theater and proscenium. A key element to displaying these garments was the use of hand-tailored mounts suspended by wire. It was important that we not use traditional mannequins. Their painted expressions and stiff physicality inferred too much uninvited meaning to the piece. Textile consultant Fionn Zarubica constructed floating mounts that, with a few exceptions, had no heads, such as Suzanne Lacey's Dracula cape, which hovered above the floor without legs from which to support its full torso. These were ghost-like suspensions held by an invisible figure that seemed to float between the ceiling and the floor. Could this figural void or negative space invite the viewer to mentally access an identity represented by the garment? Most of the figures hung eye to eye with the viewer and provided an equality of presence. The possibility that a viewer would project oneself into any of the personas on display was more likely because of the relationship to viewer, the relationship of viewer to floating garment, but also by the many iconographic images that were present. Here, Nancy Buchanan's rhinestone platform shoes worn for her performance, Rock and Roll Piece, at the surface appear as a goofy 70s fad. However, from her audio, we discovered that during her performance in 1976, she drew her own blood and signed over actual oil company stock shares to members of the audience in protest of the growing reliance of global dependence on oil. Here, the Kipper Kids, known for their male ritualistic and abject performances, provided their own forms for their English Boy Scout garments. 40 years of buildup from abject bodily fluids gained through performance made this an archivist's worst nightmare. It was disintegrating and it smelled. Also a useful tool in evoking visceral associations from the viewer. These garments and costumes read as historical records as they marked a specific period, place, and community. They also existed as sculptural records of the actions left by these performance artists. While the iconographic nature of some garments suggested a conventional cultural sign, here, a bridal veil from Richard Newton's performance, "You Take Me to a Room in Brawley and We Smell Onions," when given context by the artist's audio recording, challenged our own cultural expectations of societal norm by suggesting alternatives to the status quo. Here, Richard wore a bedsheet and wedding veil for his performance detailing bridal rape, an analogy for the artist in the white box gallery system culture during the 70s. Conscious of her use of theatricality and performance art, some artists, like Jackie Apple, experimented with the relevance of theater and illusion in their performances. In The Garden Planet Revisited in 1982, Apple's psychic-like observations of a digital and technological revolution readying itself to transform the 21st century found Charlie the astronaut, quote, trained technically, but not emotionally. Here's an excerpt by Jackie recollecting her pre-performance for that piece. Or not. Moving on. The works included in this exhibition communicated no one layer of content, but overlapped multiple layers of complexity, exploring race, class, and gender. To use the performity of memory through audio recording as a curatorial methodology to frame an equally fluid and action-based medium aligns performance art curation along the artist-centric principles of risk, chance, and possibility. Performance garments themselves tell a tale of a society of artists bringing issues of action, activism, and art to the body. Thank you.
Click on the last one. That's you. Yeah.
Oh, or is it? Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Too large.
If you believe it or not, but PowerPoint is a new thing. All right. So, yeah, the audience, thank you for being here with me, and the organizers like Lina, Jane, and Teresa, and all the other helping hands. Thank you so much for inviting me and making this possible. I just want to introduce myself briefly. I'm a freelance curator and art educator based in Leipzig, Germany. Since 8 years now, I'm working pretty close with the Museum of Contemporary Art Leipzig, where my colleague Anna Jele and me recently curated the research and exhibition project Up Till Now, reconsidering historical performances and actionist art from the GDR, which I will mainly talk about today. Up Till Now was format-wise pretty inspired by the object of its study, performance as a temporal and spatial process. Our subsuming display allowed the exhibition space to be a space of events, a stage, laboratory, workshop, and research archive, as well as a space to present artworks. This means we were focusing to a certain extent on public programs as a main part of the whole exhibition and research process. We had lectures, film screenings, a wall cafe, workshops, we had a blog, plus 6 new commissioned artworks, which were developing during the exhibition period and mostly entered the space in the last weeks of the process. Some of them stayed as installations, some only left traces, which were partly also reused by others, and some just disappeared. I'd like to see my curatorial practice pretty much informed by critical educational theory, for example, Jacques Rancière or Antonio Gramsci. This means I'd like to see myself as much as a learning and not knowing person within the whole exhibition process like anyone else who's entering the scene, the visitors or artists. I constantly try to avoid imposing certain knowledge by making multiple approaches available, which means I'm also permanently trying to adjust to all the new topics, meanings, and opinions which come in. But, and that's the most important, I allow myself also to fail, as especially the failure, I think, is a good possibility to reflect the situations I facilitated as a host. Okay, as I will not be able to talk about the whole project within this short period of time, I will only manage to go into some details. We actually just released a small documentation, unfortunately only in German, but that's why I didn't brought it, but for those who speak accidentally German, so it's available online. So, yeah, but just to mention, so we're now working on a publication in both German and English, most probably not in French, but so if you're interested, just contact me. Okay. Before I start to introduce the project, I would like to go on with a method I learned from a colleague, namely Manuela Zechner, a researcher and artist based in London and Vienna, and she's part of the Radical Care Collective I recently worked with. She calls it the Future Archive. So I will take you just on a short time travel, and you're warmly invited to go on with this, whether in the following coffee break or later at dinner. So, well, in a far future, some curators and art historians gather during an opening. On show, reenactments of historical performative work, documents like photographs, videos, props, you know, the usually suspected if it comes to historical performances. You know what I mean, like this really old stuff from 2014. So, something one of these people in a far, far future then might say, wow, crazy, in the second decade of the millennium, I think, wasn't that the third wave of feminism? Wasn't it? Yeah, well, they still struggled so much with gender issues and racism, even in the cultural field. So, and a possible reply would be, yeah, amazing these works by so-and-so, but above that, really challenging the back then neoliberal system. Today you cannot imagine that they still do not know how to deal with all this immaterial labor. And someone then might add, indeed, they still had money, right? Okay. Back to now. I propose this to you because this method maybe can explain what I was up to with Up Till Now, actually. The main idea of the Future Archive is to learn more about the status quo, about today, but also to imagine a future where things have changed, however this might look like. Possibly there is a different political system or world order. This can be utopian or dystopian, whatever you feel like to imagine. But mainly It is about the here and now, the starting point where it's going into this or that direction. You can think of various scenarios how today's performance might be read in the far future. And I think in our work there's a lot about imagining a future together. But at the same time, this method is a possibility to focus also on the past and its alternative endings in the here and now, the status quo and how history is read and how history is constructed these days. Maybe that's why I ended up with performance of artists working in the GDR era during my studies in theater and post-colonial studies, because the handling of GDR performance really made me suspicious. Okay, now I forgot about the foils. So, this is the opening. Okay, just to give you an impression how it looked inside the exhibition. Okay, what made me suspicious? Their reading was and is still to a certain extent very much guided by very specific intentions. To display resistance, opposition and the counterculture in the back then socialist workers and farmers state, the German Democratic Republic, the today's former East Germany, but only in opposition to the current politics of the now reunited Federal Republic. I don't want to criticize at all displaying resistance, opposition or counterculture, but, and that's the point, in all this reflection on the subcultural art scene, I really missed the discourse on, first, what was actually happening back then in relation to content and form. That means that in the most of the text I could find, they were often only accompanied by some glyphic images which testified that something has happened, but you could only guess what. What you could actually read on, both in interviews and texts, was how the working and living conditions of artists were at that time, which is for sure a totally important topic in the respect of the instrumentalization of art in the socialist regime, where art should follow politics. But there was really not much about the artworks. And I really missed what this can mean for us today within the recent system, where resistance is even harder as there is no inside and outside the system anymore. And opposition is very well organized in the realm of political parties in realpolitik, where there is more, I quote, Bruno Latour, about the organization of processes rather than topics or urgencies, end of quote. Latour is actually suggesting to start over and deal finally with the things itself. That's very much what I'm talking about. It seems to me that there's a really need for much more and constantly evolving process around the actual things, or like also Irid Rogov puts it, urgencies. It should begin and end in always new constellations which gather around them. We already heard the term constellation from Beatrice von Bismarck yesterday, and I will come back to her thoughts later on in this talk. Another insight. Maybe there was one thing what really made it urgent to deal with GDR performance for me, and which really encouraged me to look closer and to think of other ways of addressing the respective performances and enable a process of re-encounter. It was the observation that the most of the back then performative working artists, when asked after '89, assessed their works roughly as a joking around or playful experiments. Most of them, so it seemed like, did not really refer to their works as serious art pieces. I was just guessing, but I think this is part of the repeatedly reproduced opinion in the 1990s that in a closed society like GDR, the real discourse on performance, namely the Western, just entered in the 80s, and all the performance from that time were seen as late replies to Wiener Aktionismus, land art, Joseph Beuys, and so on. For that reason, are really relevant. And I guess if you hear something like that over and over about your very own work, I suppose you believe it after a while. There is a lot about adapting stereotypes in their reproduction here, which you, by the way, can find quite a lot in East and West Germany. Up till now, contained of various parts, I will, as I said, mostly only mention, and it tried to explore new ways of exhibiting and documenting performance art from GDR and their integration into exhibitions. Like I said, Our focus was the transfer of historical performances into a contemporary discourse and re-questioning the material. One initial question was how to deal with the archival material within the exhibitions. And are there possibilities of a performative performing archive which is polyphonic and flexible and expands over the exhibition process? We understood all the events that were taking place within the process as part of this living archive. Okay, I will now show you some pictures. So this is like the material collection, last pictures you saw. Yeah, and then we had like this space with which we started empty, and it filled itself over the whole period with always new things happening. So we invited 3 artists working performative within GDR, as well as some contemporary witnesses from the subcultural context of GDR, as well as 4 young contemporary artists all working around or with the medium of performance to go on this journey with us. And there was also Barbara Klimova, an artist from Czech Republic, who did a very exciting project series of reenactments of performances from the 70s and 80s, which was also part of the exhibition or material collection or archive, however you like to call it. Barbara actually was also invited for a performance lecture and a workshop. Yeah, there she is, with students. Yeah. Most importantly, for us was always to mention again that we did not claim to be objective or complete, nor wanted to create a linear narrative or generally valid categories. It was in the beginning our subjective starting point into a research process which turned into a collective one. We had a permanent installation of texts like you saw, film material, documents out of private archives by Gabi Stürzer, Jörg Herald and Via Lewandowski, among others. And this also expanded and changed during the exhibition, like the sheets of paper you saw. And it actually mostly contained the text I was talking about before. So they were like really, I'm not sure, is it coming another photo of that? Yeah, almost. So there were really scans of A4 and 3 prints out of the existing catalogs and research materials with photos of the prop or, I don't know, photos of the original performances. And most of the books were also accessible in the museum's library. So this gave the possibility to read up for the visitors, to go independently through the material, compare different texts on or pictures of the same work in various catalogs, you know, when you I don't know, have like the 3 iconic images and so 3 catalogs, you can find 3 different iconic views on that. So we try to mediate through that the characteristics of archives and also certain extents of the medium of performance art to the visitors and possibly deconstruct them as well and to address the difficulties of working with performance as a live medium and its documentation. But, you know, these texts could just also be read. So you can already guess why we choose to display our research like that. As simple copies, it is the way we are as researchers or curators usually and mostly encounter historical performance art before we try to dig deeper, at least I would. So this material collection was also a starting point for the participating artists who we invited, like the younger and the older ones, which turned their work both into practical and theoretical approaches to a performative archive. The process was a collaborative one, as I said, very much based on exchange, practical as well as theoretical reflection. Very important for us, but there was an interweaving of the historical material with their very own practice, which means the extraction of content-related and or formal aspects for a present discourse. So, up till now, aimed much more for a conscious transformation instead of the ambition to restage or reenact close to the original. So now I'm going to show pictures of the new works, but actually I don't have that much time, therefore I will just really go briefly through it, what is a pity because they're great, but So, Jörg Herold, he was actually performative working already in GDR time and was invited by us as a source, let's say, and then decided to do his own reflection of his back then performative work. So it was a reworking body in body, a performance he did in '89. So they are very bad photographs, sorry. So then we invited Stefan Hurtig, who is actually usually working with video and film. And so he did his very first performance for a very long time called Freedom of Sleep. I would prefer not to perform. So he was thinking of the idea of freedom in GDR and really fighting against something, and now you're, as an artist, the role model of like the how to say, yeah, in neoliberalism, the individualistic force, so production of force. So, and that's how he, in this sense, replied and was sleeping 2 times during the exhibition opening hours. So, another. So then there was Anna Hoffner, an artist from Vienna. It's after the transformation. It was a video piece she contributed actually from a long ongoing process she's in. She is taking, how do you say, steroids? So for preparing for a sex change. So, and was also working together with a speech therapist on this kind of transformation, so like really this bodily idea of, or this bodily experience of a transformation, and that it is for sure not like this clean cut like it seemed to be in '89, so changing of systems, so it's for sure totally a different level. Really amazing work. I'm really happy that we could did it. So. Then there were Elske Rosenfeld and Ingrid Konje, who were starting from Gabriele Stötzer's, actually the only feminist performance group in the GDR, starting from her work. She's pretty much working about gestures, and Elske and Ingrid were taking gestures from the eviction of Sukoti Park. So these fights between the occupied people and the police, and we're opposing them with an audio piece, so which was actually talking about the things which are now forbidden in Sukoti Park, like any unnormal behavior, like sitting on benches or lying on the ground and all that stuff. So it was really about normalization of gestures. So. Elske did another, let's kind of intervention into the material collection, which was also pretty much it was a letter to Gabi, and also working on the gestural topic. So, and then we had the Ich AG Geige, which was actually the only real, let's say, reenactment of the punk trash combo AG Geige from GDR times. So if you want to say so, we're working pretty performative. And their sign was pretty much, they were autodidacts, and they played out their dilettantism. So these times, so the artists participating in here were also all autodidacts. So, but as you can see, they didn't wear like very experimental masquerade. So they are here with a tie and very big bellies. So also reflecting maybe the position of artists in today's. These days. So, yeah, we had also a nice party with a mixtape collection from the 80s. So, yeah. So these are only just like the things which are actually happening there. I still got so much more to say. So, maybe just only a little. As you can see, and what was also unexpected for the most visitors, we did not stress the artifacts and documents, and we do not focus on preserving and conserving. We emphasize the reuse, use, and the appropriation, the reinterpretation, its productivity, and reception today. What is create between past and future? We all know that history is, to a certain honor, history is a construction serving mostly several agendas. So And a question that might help are sometimes, as you probably know, who is speaking and what is missing. So, I think it's pretty important to realize so that, as curators, it's important to always tell yourself we do not have to reproduce that, we do not have to reproduce that. And especially in the arts, I think it's, from my point of view, an amazing opportunity to question this practice of history construction and challenging anything which evolves out of that, and explore alternative ways of introducing things versus the practice of canonization and hegemonic and dominant knowledge. So, and I'm especially interested in the encounters. So I'd like really to envision these as a coming togethers on an equal level. Everybody, whether artist, audience, prop, artwork, text, is bringing in a certain knowledge which articulates during the process of encountering in various ways. And exhibitions, performances, events, and I said to you that I will come back to Beatrice von Bismarck's thoughts that I am still speaking. So so these events can be spatio-temporal structures where things can become public in the form of encounters, whereby the exhibition makers as well as visitors and objects are parts of this sequence and parallelism of constellations which establish within the exhibition. To put it with Irid Rogov, finally, the exhibition is more an occasion which is characterized by its potentiality rather than by its manifestations. Thank you.
So lonely.
Should I stay?
No.
Okay, I will sit close.
Oh, thank you. This is for you. All right, so I'm going to pull up QuickTime Player really quickly and start a movie recording of me doing this presentation. And it will become clear, hopefully if I have time, don't run out of time, why that's happening. So.
Could you bring the mic closer?
Yes. So, hi, I am Travis Chamberlain, and I am going to talk about a project that I organized last fall at the New Museum in New York City, which is a contemporary art museum there. And I'm going to talk about how this project now serves as a prompt for rethinking the museum's own performance documentation and archiving methodologies. Portions of this text were developed in collaboration with Tara Hart, the New Museum's digital archivist, as part of a series of conversations with some of the artists who were engaged by this project, in these conversations will be published in the coming months on the New Museum's online publication platform, 6 Degrees, which is edited by Terne Fazeli. Alongside its evolving engagement with performance and the need to make legible the strategies of research unique to performance as a medium, the New Museum is particularly concerned with providing evidence of ephemeral events and time-based practices that resist traditional modes of documentation and exhibition. When it opened in 1977, the New Museum's founding mission was centered around challenging the very notion of a museum's role in society and its position as collector and preserver of revealed material artifacts of culture. Early on, the museum focused on showing art that was process-oriented, site-specific, and ephemeral, including works of performance, theater, and dance. An early exhibition central to these considerations was Choices, Making an Art of Everyday Life in 1986, curated by our founding director, Marcia Tucker. Choices presented the work of 12 artists that investigated forms of lived performance by plumbing perceived distinctions between art and everyday life. In the exhibition catalog, Tucker spoke about the challenges associated with presenting this work. Quote, "Organizing the exhibition posed problems that I had never had to face before. Since there's so little of a material nature which results from the work, how could it be shown? Would it be possible to fill the museum with ideas rather than objects?" Unquote. Within a history of attempts to exhibit and support dematerialized work, the new museum also began presenting performance through an event-based structure that was often separate and distinct from the production of exhibitions. In 2007, the new museum moved to its current location on the Bowery, where it gained its first dedicated theater space. With this move, the museum's production of performance-based events and performance residencies increased considerably. This was also coincidentally the year that I was hired. I originated my position, which at the time was Public Programs Coordinator and is now, as of 2013, Associate Curator of Performance and Manager of Public Programs. I was the museum's first full-time employee whose position was dedicated exclusively to managing live public events produced in the theater. My background, I should add, is in producing and directing contemporary theater. And prior to this, I was the artistic director of a for-profit emerging performing arts venue in Brooklyn. My current job is the first job I've held in the visual art world. My position is within the Department of Education and Public Engagement, which is spearheaded by our director, Johanna Burton. So when I began working at the museum, our documentation practices were really rudimentary and basic by necessity. And in retrospect and by my current standards, really grossly underproduced. There were some reasons for this. I had no additional tech staff, except for those whom I would occasionally be allowed to hire freelance. And unfortunately, the budget, which I did not oversee, was so tight and my position was so new that I would often have to house manage, run tech, walk the Q&A mic, and document events by myself, sometimes even for things that I had curated. We used a consumer-grade standard definition camera in the early days, shooting on mini DV tape, and it was positioned all the way at the back of the room. It was there was no operator. We would just turn it on, and we did the same thing for talks and performances. It was really, really basic. For talks, we would produce high-quality audio recordings. That was it. The emphasis was on maintaining an intense production schedule with barely any budget to produce things comfortably, leaving very little time to do anything with the documentation other than put it in storage and move on to the next thing. Even if I could have managed it, there was also no system yet in place for processing this documentation into an archive. It seemed to me that this should be someone else's job, someone yet to be hired. That it was my responsibility to produce the events, and it would eventually be that person's responsibility to take the documentation and do something with it. I was completely preoccupied and frequently overwhelmed with the producing of the present. Preserving the past seemed like a relative luxury, which I could only facilitate in the most rudimentary and purely functional way. So, this is Tara Hart, our digital archivist. Tara started working at the museum in July 2011. She is the museum's first full-time professional archivist that we are aware of, which does not mean she is very quick to point out that archival work was not done previously, and clearly I was doing a bang-up job of that on my own. When she began, our physical archives, which date all the way back to the museum's founding in 1977, were in boxes on top of shipping crates in the building next door to us on the Bowery, completely unprocessed, organized only by department. And so since 2011, she has organized these beautiful shelves and started the processing of almost 40 years of history. It's a big job for one person. She was initially hired, as she says, to fill in the gaps of the digital archive, which launched in a beta version in 2009. So I'm going to give you just a quick little tour of the digital archive. You can access the digital archive through the new museum's main website. There's a little button at the very top of the website. You'll see it. It's kind of hard to see, but it's there. So this is the interface, the online interface for the website. It uses software, archival software, Collective Access. And if you were to click on Browse the Archive, you'll see different ways that you can browse the archive. These are all the ways in which different records in the digital archive are organized by these categories. So most of the things that I've done since 2007 are under public programs. And there are records for that, but we don't really have yet any sort of documentation attached to that. So I'm going to look at an exhibition. The exhibition page, you can see here, if you can sort by year or title, and then there's a listing for choices. And if you were to click on choices, it would open up this page, and there's all of this related documentation. Fast forward to November 2013. I am officially a curator now, and thanks to my new director, Johanna Burton, I'm about to organize my first exhibition, Performance, Archiving, Performance, in the 5th Floor Resource Center as part of the R&D season Archives, Research and Development, produced by the Department of Education and Public Engagement. Performance, Archiving, Performance brought together artist projects that drew upon the concept of the archive as medium, exploring ways in which performance might present a record of it itself. The projects that were included were The People to Come by the Brooklyn-based company Canary Torsi. These are installation shots of how it was installed. Redance by LA-based artist Sarah Wuki, founded by Sarah Wuki. Jennifer Monson's Live Dancing Archive. And Julie Tolentino's The Sky Remains the Same. The projects included in this multi-platform presentation conceived of the relationship between performance and archives as individual systems, where the acts of recording, storing, indexing, and redistributing are as much a part of the artwork as the performance itself. As a result, the site of performance, its position in time, space, and form, was placed in question, so that the actual process of archiving may be interpreted as its own mode of performance. Constituted by artist residencies, performances, public talks, and open studios in the New Museum Theater, Performance, Archiving, Performance included an exhibition component in the museum's Resource Center, which changed over time as it was impacted by the work and research produced in each artist's residency. Inspired by the range of modes for recording and preserving performance offered by each of the projects in Performance, Archiving, Performance, those projects now serve as a prompt for the museum to reflect on its own practices for documenting and archiving performance. So I'm now very, very briefly going to give a quick virtual walkthrough of the show and some of the residency projects, and just highlight some of the things that I feel I would like to apply to how we're rethinking documentation and archiving methodologies at the museum. So the first project I'm going to talk about is a Canary Torsi's The People to Come. The People to Come was an audience-activated, dance-generating performance installation and archiving project by Brooklyn-based company Canary Torsi, which is led by director and choreographer Janita Castro. It was designed as a streamlined system for exposing the process of making dances, wherein audience submissions serve as inspiration for movement scores that were subsequently indexed to recordings of the dances that they had inspired via an online archive. So this is the online interface for The People to Come. People were invited to, audiences were invited to submit a portrait, a task, or a pattern to this project. And then as part of a performance installation, those submissions were printed out into a physical archive on site, which a company of dancers could then access. And they would choose whatever submissions they were interested in, put them on scoreboards, and then they would go to one area that was designated for rehearsal and rehearse for 19 minutes. And then they would, from that score that they had created, and then they would move to the performance stage where they would perform that 19-minute solo. And that solo would then be videotaped and eventually the videotaping of that performance would be fed back into the archive and cataloged to all of the various audience submissions, so that the website really would become a portrait of the people who came to the project. So, what have I taken away from this project? Here's a little bit of how we engage with them. We helped them to finish the processing of their documentation through an open studio. What have I taken away from this that might be applied to our methodologies at the museum? This project helped me to think about documentation and archiving as part of a system that accounts for what it means to curate performance at the museum, placing the performance along a timeline of production where the live event is no longer the culmination of the museum's engagement with the work, but a step in the process of what engagement with performance should mean for the museum. Every step along that timeline must be thoughtfully cared for or curated, if you will. Other steps that follow the performance and are part of this engagement might include digitization and editing of the documentation, archival processing of that documentation and related ephemera, a period of reflection, gasp, followed by some form of publication. Okay, so the next project I'm going to talk about very briefly, well, the next three projects actually all explore to varying degrees the body's potential as an archive. So the body's potential as an archive, to contain and preserve dance, performance, and other indeterminate systems. They also introduce the difficulty of producing records of certain kinds of performance. Redance is a platform for researching intergenerational transmission in dance, alternative archival practices, and current economies of dance making through performances, workshops, and public conversations. While it does not present itself as an archive, Redance reveals the way in which a group of dancers are actively thinking about issues of legacy and circumnavigating traditional documentation and archival systems to create their own body-based methodologies for preserving performance across generations. So this project really developed out of Sarah Wuki's engagement with Yvonne Rayner's Trio A, in which she became one of 5 certified transmitters. But what I really want to talk about, and this is where the quick time movie comes back into place, is this piece down in the bottom corner, which is a work by Ben Evans. This was a video that was included in the exhibition for Performance Archiving Performance. Ben Evans' lecture on Déjà Vu at Once is a screen capture video by the artist of a presentation that he gave as part of a symposium organized by Redance at RDZ Institute of the Arts in Arnhem, the Netherlands in 2012. This lecture shows Evans reflecting on his experiences participating in Deborah Hayes' solo performance commissioning project, which Michelle Steinwald spoke briefly about yesterday. The inclusion of this video in Performance Archiving Performance underscored the importance of copyright as it affects archive. Redance was unable to acquire a copy of the documentation of its own symposium for its archives without purchasing it from ArtEZ, who produced the documentation and therefore owned the copyright to the material, but not its contents. Evans' screen captured video of his participation in the symposium neatly circumnavigated this problem. What have I taken away? Well, what sort of conditions, if any, should be placed on documentation produced by the museum when sharing it with artists whose work is on the recording? How might copyright considerations for performance documentation produced by the museum be pre-negotiated with artists? So I've been given a 5-minute warning, so I think I'm gonna speed through these last ones. Unfortunately, I think the last artist we can talk about in the Q&A. They're pretty provocative pictures, but I'll focus on Jennifer Monson. Live Dancing Archive is a project that developed out of Monson's interest in the dynamic relationships between living organisms and ecosystems and the desire to respond to specific ecosystems through the form of dance. The Live Dancing Archive project comes out of the research that she did in an earlier work, Bird Brain 2000 to 2006, which she has described as a multi-year navigational dance touring project that follows the migratory pathways of birds and gray whales on their journeys across the North and South hemispheres. At various sites along the migratory pathways of these animals, she and her team of researchers improvised in the open air, responding to the environment through dance. Records of this research were produced in a variety of mediums and subsequently formed the primary content of the first phase of what is now the online component of Live Dancing Archive, which launched in 2011. So it uses collective access as well, and she actually studied the New Museum's digital archive in the construction of her online archive. LiveDancingArchive.com continues to function as a repository for Monson's ongoing research exploring the relationship of place to self, as well as the ideological constructions of environment and embodied identities. In 2013, Live Dancing Archive developed further to include 2 more component parts, which premiered at The Kitchen in New York City. A video installation by Robin Vishal, which you can see on the right, as it was installed at the New Museum, compiled from video records on the online archive. And then there was also a solo dance where she directly utilized the digital archive and what she refers to as her own embodied archive as material to create a new dance for the stage. So while she was in residence, she created a piece that was good, an improvised dance for the museum's Sky Room. And you can see here that the Sky Room gets its name because of the panoramic views of Lower Manhattan. And she rehearsed this piece all day in the sunlight. And when the sun went down, we didn't turn on the lights. So the piece was performed in the dark, and it was only illuminated by the light coming in from the skyline of Lower Manhattan. And we discussed, previous to the engagement, what documentation should be produced for this. And we went back and forth about whether or not something should come of it. And ultimately, we decided to set up a camera the old-fashioned way, just place it at the back of the room and see what happens. And the documentation is literally like dark except for the dots in the skyline that you can see, and occasionally they flicker out as her body moves in between the lights and the camera. So what have I learned from that? If a video or photo cannot be produced, either because of conditions like the Sky Room concert, or because an artist explicitly wishes for no photos or video, what other kinds of recordings might be possible and permitted? Could writing and subjective recollection constitute a form of documentation? What other forms might exist, and how might they be processed into the digital archive? So I'm just going to read the intro for this project and then show the slides that I have and talk about what I got out of it, but I'm not going to go into the detail of what the project is. So, Julie Tolentino. The Sky Remains the Same explores the body's potential as both a medium and container of record. Through this project, she's invited select long-term collaborators to choose a work from their own performance history to archive into and onto her body. And in the case of the New Museum, her engagement at the New Museum, archiving work into the bodies of others. Anchored by individual contracts between Tolentino and these invited donors, who include Ron Athey, who was the first participant in this project, Franco B., David Dorfman, David Rusev, and Lovett Cognone. Each iteration of The Sky Remains the Same necessarily redefines the elements and processes for archiving a performance onto the body of another. This work produces a map of body-specific, contextual, and practical differences between each performance and its archive, which Tolentino shares with others through various live encounters. Perhaps the contents of performance archives should not be valued for how closely they resemble the thing they seek to preserve, but for their fidelity to delineate difference. This is documentation from one of the works she archived at the New Museum, the original documentation from the performance, and this is what the archiving of that work looked like at the New Museum, in which the work was archived into and onto the bodies of various staff members. And at the end of that project, the documentation from the archiving process was placed in counterpoint to the original documentation of the performance. So what did I learn from that? An archival record can take any form and exist in any medium. The processes for generating the record are similarly infinite. What constitutes a record of value is subjective. An invitation to perform can be an invitation to creatively engage with the archiving systems of the museum and how a record of one's work will be preserved. Negotiating the terms of how a record will be produced and what it will constitute can be a productive curatorial conversation about the aspects of a performance the artist values most and wishes to make legible through preservation. Which leads me to ask, finally, shouldn't accounting for documentation of performance at the museum be a key responsibility of curatorial purview? Thank you.
Oh, this is not, sorry. Do you want to lecture? Yeah.
So hi everyone, my name is Abby Siebely, and as I think I mentioned before, I work at the Walker Art Center, and I'm the Merce Cunningham Research Fellow there. And my talk is called Performance Patina, Curating the Material Traces of Live Events, and I'd like to add, or how I spent 2 years working with unitards. So, at a time when museums have a growing interest in presenting and collecting performance, the dialogue often centers on the ephemeral, immaterial nature of the work. But equally vital to consider are the objects that endure, the costumes, sets, and other design elements. My work at the Walker has been concentrated on the tangible footprints and traces of the Merce Cunningham Dance Company. So in 2011, the Walker acquired the Merce Cunningham Dance Company's complete archive of sets and costumes, comprising over 60 years worth of materials and over 3,500 objects, ranging from larger scale set pieces, backdrops, to smaller costume pieces, as well as some posters, design sketches, and a selection of photographs. Because Cunningham collaborated with some of the most prominent artists of the 20th century, it's not surprising that the museum would be interested in acquiring some of the company's signature pieces. In fact, over a decade ago, the Walker had independently acquired the set for Walk Around Time, based on Marcel Duchamp's The Large Glass, and constructed by Jasper Johns. And actually, before I show you that, this is the inside of a cape that Robert Rauschenberg shopped for Merce to wear in 1958, and he sewed Merce's initials into the cape. So that's pretty cool. So this is the set for Walk Around Time, and again, the Walker had made this acquisition about more than 10 years ago, so it was an isolated purchase. However, for the 2011 Cunningham acquisition, rather than selecting a few key items or representative pieces, the Walker diverged from its typical collecting practices and took on the complete inventory of over 60 years worth of materials into its permanent collection. Rather than making discrete choices, like selecting one leotard to represent a dance that had 7, this strategy meant that we would automatically take all 7. Lucky for me. In terms of shaping the acquisition, the process of selection was guided by the museum's holistic commitment to the creative output of Merce Cunningham and his collaborators, rather than a more micro piece-by-piece sorting and valuation process. Rather than resting on the name recognition of blue-chip artists such as Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and Andy Warhol, the collection's breadth, content, and cumulative nature pose a major shift in thinking for curators and museum visitors alike. So I'm just going to show you some other pieces that are in the collection, just to again demonstrate the variety that we've got going on. These are shoes that Merce wore, also from that same dance that the cape was from. This is a backdrop from a much later period in the company's history. And it's actually, we shot this photo in the Walker's theater as we were documenting and kind of looking for condition reports for all of these materials. This is another backdrop with a design inspired by a Liechtenstein piece. We've got lots of unitards. This is a Rauschenberg. This is another Rauschenberg. Merce worked with Rauschenberg quite extensively for a period in the 50s and 60s, as well as later on, so that's why there's a lot of Rauschenberg. This is actually kind of a very space age skirt, a set of mitts, and actually very surrealist, and headdress that was from a time before the company was even formed. So we have very early pieces up to work when the company disbanded in 2011. Then we have these sort of oddballs, like this set of makeup that came, it was actually used, this makeup dates from the 60s, but it was used for a dance called Nocturnes that Rauschenberg had come up with a makeup concept where the men had one half of their faces painted one color and another half painted another color. So obviously this doesn't exactly fit into material that was made for the dance, but it came with the dance, and so we want to accession it in some way. So many of these materials, even if crafted by seminal figures in modern art, have the quotidian wear and tear of objects of use. Some have been packed and repacked hundreds of times, pilled, mended, steamed, faded, thrown in the wash. Some of the garments retain the scent of their use and composition, the sweetness of fabric softener, occasionally the sourness of sweat, the earthiness of a bear fur coat from a 1950s era secondhand shop. As the objects were arriving at the museum, the qualities of their use stood out starkly as clear traces of their functionality. Museums are obviously prepared to handle pieces that are fragile or worn, but there is something unique, extraordinary, and even still contentious about these pieces. From my perspective, there is not a question of an implicit value, but both how this value is defined and where it lives is an ongoing question. I do think that it is important to realistically address both the magic as well as the challenges that these pieces can pose for curating exhibitions. My own experience with the Cunningham collection, working on it in the context of both the visual art department and the more registrarial, hands-on side of the operation, is that there is a conceptual enthusiasm that can sometimes be at odds with the pragmatic realities of owning and caring for the actual materials. So this was when a lot of the materials arrived all at once because the company was disbanding and we were getting shipments kind of on a weekly basis from them. And we set up, my workspace was in the Walker's painting storage for a while. So we had a bunch of materials set up in the beginning so that people could see what we had, curators and whatnot. So museums, when a sample selection of materials is spread out on a work table, we can catch a glimpse of the astonishingly saturated hues of Rauschenberg's 1960s dyeing techniques, intricately detailed accents and patterns, as well as the more quotidian wear and tear of workhorse tights and leotards. In the best of lights, this scene is a marvel. From a more critical perspective, the costumes in this form can appear small, wrinkled, bearing none of the volume or life of their original owners. My concern is how we avoid the pile of laundry misconception that these things could fall into when handled without thorough consideration. For those who are familiar with Cunningham and the legacy of his collaborators, there will be an inherent appreciation of these materials. But we should not assume that everyone has this level of familiarity or that when visitors enter the gallery space, they are ready to make that conceptual leap from stage to exhibition context. So what are the types of material traces that these objects bear? Because when I talk about the traces of performance, I'm not just talking about the objects themselves I'm also interested in looking at the signs of wear on the objects themselves. So I'll just skip over that. So I actually love this image of steps, which is totally just a Google image. And this idea of materials being worn down and how they reflect a very particular kind of movement that has happened time and time again on them. So, as I mentioned, I'm interested in thinking about the traces not only as objects, but as the unique wear and erosion of the objects. The pieces themselves are inert, seemingly totally separate from the live events that they were once part of, but rather than casually dismissing the pills and the wear and all of the quotidian traces of use, how can we gain a new understanding and appreciation for them as participants in those live experiences? In the case of the costumes, I'm interested in exploring how the traces of movement serve themselves as a form of documentation, providing sustained impressions of the particular bodies and movements that were undertaken within them, like footprints or strata of experience. So I'll show you what I mean. Here's an image of a costume that Merce wore for a solo in 1944, and actually this is the back of, and you can see in the original photograph what it looked like. And you can see just faintly on the pants like a dirty outline of the backs of his legs and his butt and all of that. And here you can see the front. One knee in particular has got a lot of dirt on it. And I was really interested in what that said about the kind of movement that was actually performed in it, and also how it really reflected Merce's own form. And there was some layer of history in there beyond just looking at it as dirt and grime. Here's another example. It's really hard to see in this picture, but I'll give you another picture. So this is I didn't put in the date. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. This is an unedited slide, but it is Bruce Nauman. And this costume is actually Valda Setterfield's, and she's in the center of that still from a film version of this dance. But she's on her butt, and I'm very interested in that because the costume is very pilled in that area. There's the pills. Same thing, here's another costume that Merce wore, and I love how the elbow is poked out. Again, suggesting a very human presence was in these garments. The material traces in these objects contrast with other kinds of movement traces that are visible in other modes of art in the Walker's collection, and I just want to show you a few of those. So this is a work that Trisha Brown did that is a flat print that hangs on the wall. And of course, this is a pretty famous piece. Both of these latter works are maps of live events composed of deliberate traces of movement tracked in paint and ink on flat surfaces that can be hung on the gallery walls. The traces are deliberately recorded at the outset, intended to be a central part of the works, rather than incidental byproducts of constant use and interaction, like those pills and the dirt. At least in a white cube context, their medium and formal qualities of the Eve Klein and Trisha Brown may pose less of a challenge than the worn leotard, at least at the outset. So while I've described a practice of closely examining these performance objects in order to study the traces of movement, I want to qualify that not every scratch or scuff is the product of repeated movement that can be mapped onto specific choreographic gestures. So there's a famous dance that Merce did called Rainforest, where Jasper Johns created these costumes. Andy Warhol did the decor, which are these mylar silver cloud pillows, and he suggested originally that the dancers perform nude, and Merce ixnayed that, and Johns came up with flesh-colored leotards and tights as a compromise. But Merce did ask him to roughen them up a bit, as if the skin were torn. So Johns ripped and shredded the flesh-colored garments intentionally to distress the fabric and preempt the wear that would eventually occur to them over time. The traces were deliberately produced at the outset as opposed to emerging as a byproduct of the movement and use. In this discussion of the objects of performance, I think it's important to acknowledge these distinctions between remnants of repeated bodily wear versus episodic traces of movement that are intended, at least at the outset, to be inherent parts of the final work. So how do we go about seeing and presenting these objects in a new way, emphasizing their relationship to the performances that they belong to, but without over-glorifying them as relics? It would be impossible to read meaning into every individual scuff mark in a forensic CSI way of looking. And as the rainforest costumes illustrate, sometimes the wear and tear can be a deliberate effect. But a shift in perspective, acknowledging and appreciating the traces of movement can give us a new respect for the objects of performance and a deeper understanding of the movement and live events that once embodied them. So I've got 5 minutes and I'm just gonna zoom through. We have done at the Walker 3 research, we're calling them research exhibitions that dealt with specific collaborations related to these different sets and costumes. So I pulled up this one first. This was a collaboration that Merce did with Ray Kawakubo, who's the founder of Comme des Garçons. And these actually proved to be, they were the easiest to work with. They weren't easy to work with, but in terms of putting them on mannequins, Kawakubo's a fashion designer, and these were obviously meant to be seen under museum-friendly conditions. The bright lights, the white walls, all of that. In fact, her decor design, you can see an image of it, an enlarged image of the stage behind it, was very hot white anyway. So this was kind of, I won't say, it was an easier concept to translate these into the gallery setting. That's not the case with all of these materials. This is another research exhibition that we did, which was actually just an installation of one of the sets from Views on Stage, a decor that, or Other Animal, a decor that Ernesto Neto designed for this dance called Views on Stage. So we just basically recreated as best we could the stage in the gallery setting. Although it was interesting because you could walk around and see different dimensions of the piece in a way that you weren't able to, obviously, when you were sitting in the audience. So it provided a more three-dimensional perspective to the work. But I'm also really interested, this happens to be Minutia, which is again, a very famous piece that Rauschenberg created, actually the first freestanding combine piece that he created ever, for Merce's dance called Minutia as well. And this is actually a reproduction in the photograph, both photographs, it's the reproduction. So the original became very valuable, was sold at auction, and then this piece was recreated at Rauschenberg, with Rauschenberg's blessing in 1976 for a TV program. And I love how the recreators included a picture of Rauschenberg in the piece, which I've included a picture of that. And I think it's important as we consider how we display these objects that we think about exposing these little moments, like in the beginning, inside of the cape with the initials and whatnot. So just not relying on the image of the garment that you would see on a mannequin. So here I just wanted to give you, again, more of a sense of some other pieces that we're working with and thinking about. I'm sorry, I'm going quickly. This is another one of those, looks one way from afar, has some cool details that you'd never see otherwise, unless somebody pointed them out. There's Merce stitched into, embroidered into the inside collar. And there's also this little foot charm, winged foot charm that the designer put just on his wrist, maybe as a little tongue-in-cheek. This is a close-up of a unitard that was done in 2011 for the company's last performances at the Armory, and I really love the red W, which was actually a picture of New York's skyline taken from Cunningham's former facilities in West Beth, in the West Village. But I just love that glowing red W, and again, that's something that you might not otherwise notice if you were just looking at it on just a normal mannequin. This is the performance that it came from. I also am not so excited. Kawakubo's sort of fashion-esque costumes aside, I'm not really excited about mannequins. So I'm really trying to think about other ways to convey these traces of movement and performance. I actually think that this is a less successful way of displaying this headdress. It kind of looked like Cousin It to me. And so this is something, if we're talking about a research exhibition, I wouldn't necessarily, this was a piece of research that I wouldn't want to repeat. So one thing that I did, I know that this is involving kids and it was actually more of an education-based project, but I think it definitely bleeds over into my sort of curatorial sensibility about continuing to work with this stuff is how do we not only get people to look at this with their eyes, but really think about it with their bodies? And that's, again, I think a point that I was trying to bring up with the traces of movement is that you're not just looking at the garment and going, it's dirty, it's worn, but that you're really thinking about the bodies and the movement that wants to place within it. And so I did design these movement tours that we did with kids, and we were going through the gallery and looking at the materials, but instead of saying, what color is it? You know, what shape is it? We were really thinking about weight. How would you move if you had to have one of these parachute dresses on your, they're like 10 pounds, they're really heavy. How are you traversing through the gallery? What kinds of paths are you making? So even if they don't come out, you know, doing pliés and pirouettes or whatever, at least that they have a more corporeal sense of their own bodies and can maybe have an empathy with the works that they're looking at. I also just quickly wanted to bring up in my research this artist, I hope I don't butcher his name, Bohan Sarcevich, who did this interesting exhibition where he asked day laborers to wear their finer clothes to work so that the clothes that wouldn't normally be messed up and sort of grubbied up were messed up, and then he displayed them on these flat tables, again, not really hanging up in kind of a vitrine, pristine way, but really allowing people to circumnavigate through the galleries in a more sort of egalitarian way. So I just like these references for what we could do. So just in closing, we are constantly making new movement traces in our everyday lives, physical footprints of our own actions and movement. Movement traces are such an ordinary part of our existence that we may overlook them in both life and art. But the objects of performance will give us more if we ask more of them, even after they've been retired from their active use and performance. In terms of displaying these objects in a museum setting, the question is often raised, will they hold up to the close scrutiny of the gallery context, particularly when viewers peer at close range, at features that were formerly concealed by distance, moving bodies, and stage lighting. I think that the objects can handle it, but our appreciation for how they have been used and why they are considered objects of performance will be enhanced by our awareness of the movement traces that they contain.
Thank you so much. So I'm inviting Ellie and Abby and Julia and Travis to come back up to the table so that we can conduct a question and answer session. Si vous avez des questions ou des commentaires, c'est maintenant le moment. Is there anyone, and I'd ask you please to come up to the microphone and identify yourselves.
Hi, Kobe Rogers Hall. I'm curious how each of your reflections engage with collection, accumulation, and preservation, which are tensions that I encounter in the desire to create either participatory or living or changing archives. I feel like you all spoke really well to those strategies, and then I'm curious to what we're up against and whether you engage directly and or avoid, destroy, etc. But to me, it's always there in the given forms that we're playing with.
Yeah. So yeah, this is coming up in my dialogues with our digital archivist, Tara. The new museum has a reputation for being a largely non-collecting institution. However, there's certainly a question of when you produce documentation and place that into a digital archive, what does that mean? Is that a form of collection? So we're exploring that at the moment, actually.
I felt which was kind of a unique situation where in rummaging through these many artists' archives, like I say, many of them didn't ever consider them to be ever on display, but they couldn't let go of them, so they held on to them for 40 years, and when they handed them over to me for the exhibition, they came in garbage bags, Trader Joe bags, any kind of bag you can imagine out of the back of a truck. And this often happens with artists, you know, when you're involved with a museum, there's more care taken. Artists sort of divorce themselves at times from their archive so that they can let it go. At the time, the exhibition was very low funded. I had very little money to do it, and so I contacted a bunch of staff members from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and asked them to work for free. And they did. So I had a textile archivist come and work with me, and it was an incredibly aggravating experience because the artists didn't care how these things were being treated, but the archivist was so deliberate in every way that we managed, held on, or stored these things. We painted the walls in the gallery a certain color because textiles require a certain temperature that you cannot rise above because it no longer functions as archivally safe. We used industrial felt and PVC pipe in a way that it was archival to the costumes. The costumes and garments were never allowed to touch tabletops. Everything was always managed under plastic tans. It was a very involved, very, very difficult installation that took many, many days to install because of this woman who very graciously, Fionn Zerulica, donated her time, and without it, I think we would have had a less stellar installation. But I learned a lot about it, and when we did return the garments back to the artists, they were all wondering where the archival mounts were, and were they coming back in archival bags, and they didn't want the Trader Joe bags anymore, they didn't want the garbage bags, they wanted them back in a way that I feel they felt had been dignified through the exhibition, so I took that as a compliment in a way.
So what I've learned is that, first of all, I think that these kinds of acquisitions are really great. I definitely believe in the respect that these objects are now getting. But it's incredibly, just to reiterate, it's incredibly hard work. And the museum's kind of, not inertia, but slow sort of, there's a million steps that have to go between everything you do to these objects. Is at odds with the volume of stuff. So, as I mentioned, I cataloged I'm so proud of this that I can say it now, 3,443 costume pieces, which is everything from, you know, these fantastic leotards to like dance belts. So the gamut, and all of them had to be treated with kind of a similar level of, they all had to be measured, they all had to be conditioned, they all had to be, you know, cut the tissue, put the thing, tag it, you know. So I think that in terms of the way things are acquired these days, that if these acquisitions are going to continue to happen, which I don't, you know, necessarily think is a bad thing, it's great, but that the museum's structure for acquisition is going to have to change, because I've been working solely on this collection for the past almost 3 years now, and obviously MERS has a significant volume of work over a significant period of time, and not everybody's going to be like that. But the amount of time shouldn't be underestimated, and I think also where the work is going. If it's going into the archive or being acquired through into a permanent collection through a visual art or other mode, that makes a huge difference. The Walker has an archivist and has its own archive, but these materials did not go through that pipeline at all and are getting the treatment that any other work going into the permanent collection would.
Yeah, as I explained, for up to now, we didn't need it or didn't want it, something to be archived or working with the collection or with the props or with the original documents. So, and yeah, for me, this is also a lot of a discourse about the commodification of objects, I think. So I think it's really important, and especially, so it was quite interesting to hear about both of your works are actually really dealing with that. And I think for me it's very much about, okay, how to bring back the life into the things, yeah, and not just like have it contained somewhere, but so actually really dance with these Merce Cunningham props on your, we have in the museum's collection this amazing Franz West object, so, and it's made for use, but we do not have the money that it's going to fall apart, so every time when I'm in there with visitors, I'm kind of, okay, come on, just gotta keep it secret, but let's just do it and work with that, so only to keep this alive because it was made for that, so, and that's something what I'm always, still got no really answer to, so for me it was kind of a relief of not working with that, or, I don't know, maybe just like ask artists to just get all the props together and then just like play with them and really, I don't know, so especially in this case it's different. And well, also from the perspective, I'm working a lot on the ethnographic museum, as I'm also coming from that direction, and I think there you've got a totally overwhelming context of objects from a colonial discourse and so on. And I think maybe it would make sense to also apply this a little bit into the whole discourse, So.
Are there any others?
Hi, I'm Rasmus from Denmark. First of all, thank you for a very interesting panel, and a very well-curated panel, I should say. It seems to me that in between your presentations, there's a discussion between maybe deconstructive and reconstructive methodologies that I think is quite interesting in terms of the politics of archiving, actually, and the performative modes of interpretation that we are able to engage our viewers with. So I don't know, maybe I don't know if I'm going to pose it as a question. You touched a little bit on difference in your way of dealing with things, which is something that I'm also working with. So I don't know if it could be a discussion about notions of repetition and difference, or just a more general discussion of reconstructive versus deconstructive strategies.
The project that I didn't really get to go into that much detail on, which he's referencing, is Julie Tolentino's The Sky Remains the Same. And the first image that I showed of the Ron Athey, the first phase of that project where she invited Ron Athey to participate in that, the invitation was select a work that you would like to archive into and onto my body. And he didn't want to choose a work from the early 90s, which was sort of when his first big peak in his career, and also a moment of controversy in his career. But he wanted to think about a work that he was in the process of developing at that moment, self-obliteration #1. And so, in thinking about what the terms for archiving that work would be, when archiving it into and onto Julie's body, what they decided was that he would always be present for the archiving presentations of those works. And he would first perform the work while she watched, and then they would perform the work. He would perform the work again with her, and then afterwards, if they weren't completely exhausted from the piece, they would have a conversation. But they would frequently have conversations after the fact at other venues. And the conversation component was a really, really important part of what it meant to actually archive that work, because it gave them an opportunity to really talk about the idea of what if the performance was designed specifically for Athie's body as a gay male, HIV positive male, and then you're archiving that into Julie's body, which is a queer Filipina body, female body, and what does that tell us about the performance, and thinking about how the body as a repository could delineate some sort of difference, and discussion about that difference, and the context of difference.
Well, first of all, my exhibition took place at an alternative performance space, Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, which is a nonprofit, and has been around for a long time in LA, where they strive to show work that's on the cutting edge. I think, frankly, I was surprised that the caliber of these artists wanted to participate. We didn't have any budget. Many of them are historicized in the art books. But they were intrigued by the concept. They were intrigued by the fact that I was an artist, approaching it from what I thought was an uninstitutional sort of way. I was given a sort of, well, I guess mandate of this year, this frame of 1970 to 83. And going back to Paul, meeting with him, he had shown me a couple of pieces that he was really into. He liked the idea of the show. He wanted to show this one particular piece. The date fell after my time frame, and I didn't know what to do. I was stuck, and I went back to the executive director of Lace, and she said, "It doesn't matter. Talk to him, see what he thinks." And he's like, "The date is irrelevant to me. The date is just an institutional marker. It has nothing to do with the concept of how this piece developed and where I find it significant or how it contributed to this era or my community." And so I think I would use that example as a way of how I tried to give the autonomy back to the artist in framing their own work. These artists were in their 70s. Barbara T. Smith is 80 years old. They've been teaching in high caliber art schools for many, many, many years. I felt in some ways I didn't even want to try to explain to them what their work meant. I thought they could do it better. And the idea of the audio recordings came from these interviews with them. So I really tried to approach it from an artist's sensibility.
Well, I'm not necessarily sure if there is really this distinction between reproductive and deconstructive, and if it is really had to be made up. So I'm not clear with that. So a bit exhausted right now. So, but I think it's always important to address, especially also the product as well as the reproduction. So to, I don't know, deal with it and and whatever construct it. So, yeah, but it will be interesting to think a bit more. So, especially in these cases of this very really well curated examples, I think, on the topic. Yeah.
Can I just say, one of the funnest times I had with this collection that I was working on was when those early days when you saw I had they're basically ping pong tables covered with acid-free paper, down painting storage, and artists would come through who had nothing to do with the project at all. Like Miguel Gutierrez's company was in town at one time, and they just came down, and just this chance encounter that they would have with this material, that for me reaffirmed every hour that I was spending with this stuff that seemed like it was winnowing my life away. Because to see them not only get excited about new material or old material, but to see it kind of start turning their creative wheels about new ideas, that was a really inspirational moment. So I don't know if that's more about re or D, but yeah, anyway, it was cool.
Are there any final questions?
So my name is Bertie Ferdman. Thank you. It was a really wonderful panel. I have a question about audience. I think that what you're all talking about is using performance methodologies in exhibitions. In a way, you're objectifying performance, but not in a bad way, not in a commodification way. I'm just curious, all the photos you showed us through your conceptual, thinking about them, but in performance, we're always thinking of, as performance makers, we're thinking about the audience, like where they are, how they're seeing it, time. How do you, especially duration, I'm just curious if you can address how the audience saw it.
All right, so I think, as I mentioned, the performance archiving performance was presented as what we referred to as a multi-platform presentation, and we searched for a term for this for a while, actually, before we landed on that. There's a little bit of tension around whether, because it was positioned within education and as a sort of research-driven project, whether or not what was presented in the Resource Center could be called an exhibition and actually archived as an exhibition into the digital archive, which is a discussion I have to have. So the work was, the audience could, or visitors, could encounter the work through the installation of the archives that were specific to the presentation in the Resource Center. Because we were dealing with archive projects, there's a certain scalability to those projects, which was fun to think about, and it was such a tight space. Like, each one of these projects was sort of an onion in a way. So like, you would sit down at a computer and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, there's a universe. So that was one way. And then the other was throughout the duration of the presentation, the material presentation, we had a series of open studios for the artists who were in residence. And that was essentially like, we turned the theater into a white box space that they could do, each artist sort of investigated, activated their project in different ways, and were addressing the questions that were central to the curatorial inquiry through their own practice. And so in addition to that, we also had a series of public program talks and things like that. So, and then there were performances. Julie's project had culminated in a performance as part of Performa last year.
Sorry, if we could just have a very quick answer back. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut this off. So
no, my mind's blank. I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. I feel like I've been the bad guy in all of this. I'm trying to keep people down within their time and whatnot. There's such compelling topics.
Not at all. Just very quickly, an audience favorite was the artist Jackie Apple, who had a red cotton jumpsuit with a NASA patch sewn to the shoulder, and it was floating above the room as if it were in flight. And when you called up and listened to it, I tried to play it, but I lost the file because I was so nervous trying to get it all together. She explains that it was for her pre-performance for the Garden Planet Revisited, where she drove to Texas and put on a Southern accent, put the suit on, put her hair in Princess Leia buns, and she walked into the NASA offices with a clipboard and said she needed to do some checks on the shuttle. And she goes into character and she starts speaking in this long Texas drawl, which I was really hoping to hear the interpreter do. Sorry about that. I apologize to you. So anyway, she goes through the story of talking her way into the shuttle, sitting down. They're telling her she needs to call Neil Smith, and she's like, and she's sitting in the shuttle alone, and she sees the power button, and she says, "What the hell?" So I pushed it in her audio. So I think in response, I think the viewers were already framed that this was a historical exhibition because it was a part of Pacific Standard Time, which was, like I say, that historical initiative by the Getty. But the telephone recordings brought it into the present. They were all, except for one, I think, were current, present recordings addressing the audience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much to our speakers, also to our technical people, and also to our simultaneous interpreters. Thank you so much. And now back over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for coming, Steph. Thank you again. No, thank you so much. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and this room is going to be, there's bilingual support. I'll tell the translators, you can come out and relax now and be helpful. I'll explain it better. There's just, the translators will be here to support a bilingual conversation. Also, the thing about the dinner is this. I'm better equipped now. Your menu is in your welcome pack. It's a good opportunity for networking. There was something else, and I don't remember. Oh well, anyway, so I hope you can make it. You confirm that you're coming or not. That was the other thing, just confirm.
Where do we go to do that?
See